Kia ora, Mr. Speaker. Ni hao, Mr. Speaker. And this bill makes a number of tax-related amendments. It introduces some sensible changes and a number of remedial amendments. Labour will support this bill to the Select Committee. Broadly speaking, this bill makes a number of amendments to GST, including zero-rating land transactions where both parties are GST registered, adjustment to changes use, nominated persons, and GST treatment of accommodation. It also makes a number of other changes to KiwiSaver legislation, the tax treatment of government-allocated ETS units, PI schemes, and the tax treatment of superannuation fund. A basic element of the GST system is that transactions between businesses should be GST neutral. However, infrequent transactions of significant assets, such as land, often create GST consequences for which businesses may not have planned. There is also a substantial risk to the tax base through Phoenix fraud schemes that involve new revenue for the government. So this amendment requires a GST registered supplier to charge GST at the rate of 0% on supply of land when the purchaser is also GST registered. A transaction between a registered supplier and a non-registered purchaser remains subject to existing rules. So that's the first point. The second one is adjustments for change in use. The current change in use rules that apply when assets are used for both taxable and non-taxable purposes will be replaced with an approach that apportions the input tax deductions according to the actual use of goods and services. And thirdly, transactions involving nominated persons. Because GST is a tax on transactions, most transactions involve only two parties, i.e. vendors and purchasers, and the legislation is not designed to cater for arrangements in which a purchaser nominates another person to receive the goods or to settle the transaction or both. The fourth one is commercial accommodation provided by GST registered person is GST taxable. Broadly speaking, accommodation in a dwelling is excluded from the tax base because if GST were applied to rents, owner-occupier of residential dwellings would have a preference over tenants who reside in rental properties. The definition of dwelling is intended to apply in circumstances that have a reasonable level of sustainability between renting and owning a home. This goal is not currently achieved because of the potentially wider interpretation of the term dwelling. So this bill amends the definition of dwelling and commercial dwelling to clarify what types of accommodation fall within the ambit of the definitions and to ensure better alignment of the GST treatment of equivalent types of accommodation. Interestingly, this bill makes a number of amendments to KiwiSaver. It is regrettable that the government did not use this bill to undo the damage it did to the scheme in cutting KiwiSaver. National gutted KiwiSaver by halving the amount of money that the government put into it and decreasing the amount that people will save. Now, we have been talking about the savings problem in New Zealand for some time now. National's response was to cut KiwiSaver, the first real attempt to lift private sector household savings in New Zealand. It also cut payments in the super fund. Bill English has spent the last couple of days bemoaning our level of indebtedness to the world. Unfortunately for him, after 2 years in government, both Treasury and the Reserve Bank are forecasting the problem to get worse. National's belated decision to set up a savings committee is an admission is an admission. They know they have been caught without a credible plan or milestones to catch up with Australia. So 2 years, 2 budgets, and now they plan to set up a committee. Labour understands and always has that the biggest difference between New Zealand and our neighbour Australia and our neighbouring Australian economies is Australia's better savings record. KiwiSaver spearheaded Labour's commitment to turning this around, but National gutted the scheme as soon as it came to office and suspended contributions to super fund. Let me quote a New Zealand Herald editorial entitled Compulsory Super Best Way Forward. And let me quote, "So compelling is the case for compulsory superannuation that it is a mystery why the government is setting up yet another working group. It needs only look across the Tasman, where the concept has proved so successful over the past 2 decades that almost 2/3 of Australians now support an increase in contributions to their compulsory scheme from 9 to 12%. End quote. So the core issue is the sustainability problems of New Zealand superannuation as the baby boomers move into retirement. The government's response to this has been sharply constrained by 2 acts. And the New Zealand Herald went on to cite the 2 acts. The first was the Prime Minister's unfortunate remark that he would resign if his administration ever changed the entitlements for national super. The second was the government's suspension of current fund contributions. Another road that pays for retirement needs will have to be carved out. So importantly, compulsory superannuation would provide the added benefit of building a much-needed savings base and reduce the country's reliance on borrowing from overseas. On that note, there are 2 other intrinsic issues. The first one is that our young people are struggling, and our elderly Kiwis struggle to make ends meet. And if you are in the middle, and if you happen not to be the privileged few, but happen to be the ordinary, many ordinary New Zealanders, you are struggling too. And another problem, as observed by Bernard Hickey, is that around 62% collectively of our extra savings are being invested overseas. Currently, 69% of the New Zealand super funds is invested offshore. Once the cash invested here is included in the total, it's 81% without cash. And just over 40% of the New Zealand $5.5 billion invested in KiwiSaver has been invested overseas as well. To sort out the problem, the obvious answer is to save more domestically, and the obvious mechanism is to make KiwiSaver compulsory while also retaining the current universal New Zealand superannuation system as a safety net. Thank you very much.
Aaron Gilmore.